Zimbabwean government says it will start paying compensation to farmers who lost land under former President Robert Mugabe's administration. The funds will be paid in installments, with the first one to go out before the end of October. The government says this is part of a broader effort to revive the country's agricultural sector. I'm now joined by the Chief Executive Officer of the Zimbabwean National Chamber of Commerce, Christopher Mugaga, and Zimbabwean farmer Rusty Markham, who are both joining us from Zimbabwe this morning. A very good morning to you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for making time for us. Christopher, let's start off with you. What's your understanding as the Chamber of Commerce, what this new program means, and also the compensation for these farmers?
Thank you, Adrian, and good morning to your viewers too. Yeah, what's more significant is to have an appreciation of the background to which the compensation is taking place. I think you will recall with the ushering in of the current administration in 2017, one of the resolutions was to come up with a program to compensate those farmers who had lost their land. But the compensation was not premised on compensating them for losing the land, but on improvements in what was contextualized or called the Global Compensation Agreement. You could have heard about it. This is a deal which had pushed for those farmers who had lost their land to be compensated to the tune of about $3.5 billion US. How the figure of 3.5 billion was arrived at, possibly, yes, there could be debate on it, but it's argued that the farmers, after sitting from their commit side, they put for about $5.4 billion US, and government of Zimbabwe was willing to pay about $1.7 billion. And in negotiating, that's when then they came up with a figure of $3.5 billion. So what you have to appreciate is the legal or the constitutional imperative surrounding the requirement to pay. So the debate is no longer whether it's necessary or not. The payment has to happen. Of course, there have been different schools of thought on whether or not it was important or rather relevant for the payment to happen. But because it's now catered for within our 2013 constitution and it's known that it has to happen, so there's no more debate on the constitutional or legal debate on the payment, but rather the economic side possibly is what can be debatable on this subject.
Okay. Rusty, let's bring you into the conversation. Are you part of the 444 farmers that will be compensated?
Well, there are two things running parallel. One is the 444 farmers that are being compensated. I believe there's 35 million in the budget set aside for that. Then there is 20 million set aside, which is different, which is actually the BIPA farmers, the Bilateral Investment Protection and Promotion Agreement, which is signed between donors and the government of Zimbabwe. Now, that precedent, there is a precedent to that. In 2016, and it's registered in our blue book, which is the budget, there was 30 million made available by the Dutch government to compensate 11 Dutch farmers. So that precedent on the 20 million, that is what we call, what you can call foreign investors who came in here and were covered by that bilateral agreement. The amount of 35 million or the 444 farmers, I am not comfortable in the concept. First of all, to answer your question, no, I'm not. And I'm a little bit different from all the farmers. In my own personal capacity, I'm not interested in compensation. I want restitution. I bought the farm 20 years ago, and I don't want the money. I bought the farm because I am Zimbabwean, I'm a citizen, and I want to farm. But getting back to the global settlement deed, the global settlement deed, the 3.5 was arrived at mutually and was supposed to be a fire sale to government to get that 3.5 for farmers, I don't know, about 5 years ago. Well, 2 or 3 attempts at paying the farmers hasn't really worked. So they've now got a second agreement together, and now they're now talking of a 10-year agreement to pay back farmers. My issue with that is the whole loan is the whole agreement is secured in local currency with bonds or without bonds. Even in the budget, the debt is a domestic debt that leaves it wide open for major issues pertaining to devaluation, to raising the money, etc., etc.
Yeah. So since the rapid land reform program was introduced, and after you had bought your farm, Rusty, did that have an impact on you at all? Because I remember there was also a time where you had the war veterans who were going around farms that were owned by white people, sometimes even white Zimbabweans, and literally grabbing the land and forcing the occupants on the land out.
Yeah, I don't want to get into my personal thing, but yes, that's roughly what happened. Just a point of correction there. And when I was in my previous life in the 9th Parliament, I did raise the issue of land reform, but not pertaining to white farmers. Everyone talks of white farmers. No one talks of I thought it was 427 indigenous farmers, black farmers who lost their land. But the Minister of Agriculture himself corrected me and said there's 650. Now, I would like to know if in the 444 farms, if any indigenous farmers are getting compensated. They are covered by statutory instrument 62 of 2020, in which they're supposed to get their farm back under a 99-year lease, which to date has not happened.
Okay. And Christopher, what's your understanding around that, where it comes to black farmers as well, who may have lost their land due to what I mentioned now as well, where you'd find war veterans charging on those lands and then literally grabbing the land and forcing the occupants out?
Yeah, look, it depends on where you stand, but this is definitely a political question, obviously, with the legal implications. Like I said at the beginning, what is most significant, Adrian, I think, is an appreciation that the Global Compensation Agreement, being the legal framework defining the whole compensation agreement, the fact that it is in existence, it means there is certainty. Mm-hmm. It also means it's now clear on what the position on compensation is. If you remember what I said, looking at the economics of it, maybe your question rather would focus on what would be the implications to the bottom line, especially given that the nation had been on the fiscal cliff edge for some time, where the numbers in terms of fiscal performance has not been quite impressive. And the other quarters then will question to say, what could be the sustainability path which could have been pursued outside what has been considered? Like my fellow Honorable Mark is just saying now, to him, it was not necessarily important to be compensated. But I believe what is most significant is to send that signal to the international markets that property rights are respected, is to send the signal that the land reform program also was unavoidable, because sometimes people lose it when they start arguing on the whole debate on what could have done or what could have not happened. What has happened has happened. And like I said, if you are to invoke a political doctrine question, the issue is land reform, even in the courts of law. If you look at the Supreme Court judgment, be it in 2002, 2005, I think you will see how even courts then under Mugabe, who was the Chief Justice, struggled to move around the whole land issue. It is a political doctrine question more than a legal issue. And maybe what is more necessary now is how do you firstly compensate? And the compensation already in place. But the second question, obviously, is to what extent is it sustainable? But stretching it to 10 years, I understand where the government is coming from, knowing fully well, like I've just confessed to you, that it's a nation on a fiscal cliff edge, where you look at the fiscal performance with no budgetary support from any part of the world. It's always going to be a very tough walk in the park, I'll call it that.
Yeah. Speaking also from a political perspective, again, Christopher, is the question around the Lancaster Agreement and the British government not adhering to that agreement. To what extent should the British government take responsibility for the actions that some have said had forced the Mugabe administration to literally push through this land reform, even though that it meant that some farmers would lose their land, and on top of that lead to a question around food security within Zimbabwe? Tony Blair, to be specific, because that question will remain there.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look closely, I'm happy you mentioned the Lancaster Agreement, but outside the Lancaster Agreement, if you look at the very global compensation agreement we are referring to at this juncture, you will see the compensation is for improvements on the farm and any transition costs possibly which could have been incurred, as well as the biological assets which were lost. And there'd never been a debate on compensating. What's more significant, Adrian, understand that the compensation is not for the land which was lost. The reason why the argument is not on the land lost is because of the prerogative or the duty of the former colonizer, then in this case, Britain. I think if you remember, the then Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Claire Short position being clear that possibly they are not committed to honoring the obligation. But the government of Zimbabwe had been quite clear to say there is no other option, there is no way out. In terms of the land itself, there is no compensation. Even if we were to look at the Zimbabwe constitutional provisions, you look at section 175, you look at quite a number of sections which took into it also. You will see the debate is on improvements. For the British or London Harare relations regarding land, I think you know it's a never-ending standoff, which will require its own possibly resolution or rather mechanism to deal with it. But at this juncture, I think, Adrian, what is more important for your viewers and what is more important for anyone who may not be well versed with the subject is to what extent possibly, given both the monetary and fiscal risks which are resident in the Zimbabwean economy, is it practical possibly to even somehow summon the debate on the compensation? I think that's, to me, that's what should be more important at this time.
Okay. Rusty, from your end, the question that is raised by Christopher around the sustainability, if you take into consideration as well the previous agreement and where there had been failure to meet the deadline to pay and compensate, do you think that it is sustainable?
No, of course not. Chris is 100% right on that one. We are in a cleft stick here in the context that we have got a huge debt burden. Most people would say unsustainable. We're coming off the back of a tremendous drought. You can't just pick up $3.5 billion now and try and pay it out. Even the interest on that, if there was interest, would be unsustainable for the very simple reason is that so as a result of that, the government is trying to raise the money domestically, and that's why they're tackling BIPA, because BIPA is covered by international community. Now, if you look at it, for anyone to get involved in this, including the government of Zimbabwe, we have to do something that's going to solve the problem that's sustainable. So the first thing you've got to do is the people who are going to give the money, they must be available for loan, and we must have a practical solution to the land problem in Zimbabwe. That's number one. Number two, the compensation that is to be paid in whatever form must be free and must be fair. Fair to the government of Zimbabwe and fair to the farmer and fair to the financier. That way, once we get a comprehensive agreement, we can start looking at numerous issues. Christopher quite rightly mentioned the issue of land. The issue of land is a government-to-government issue between the government of Zimbabwe and the British government, the previous colonial powers. So what we should be doing and what government should be doing is, together with the farmers, putting together a package, a global financed package to solve the issues around agriculture in Zimbabwe. And I'll tell you why. The biggest issue we have in Zimbabwe is the government have been spending a fortune on various programs, command agriculture, on guaranteeing debt from banks, from free inputs. And over the years, it has helped. But the bottom line we have in this country, no one has got security of tenure. And secondly, no one can trade that. So if you go bust, who do you give your title deeds to? And what are your title deeds worth? So fast-track land reform took away probably about $3 billion worth of collateral, which farmers could borrow. The new farmer can't borrow against his land and the development. So that's a major issue. That's a major hindrance issue to him. So you've got to get tradable title. The only way you can get tradable title that is acceptable to the people in commerce and the people in the banks is by being politically correct. And the whole problem is, let's get politically correct amongst ourselves so that we can get on and bring this country back up to the agricultural level it was known for. Yes, there are products like tobacco doing well, but that's a crop that's funded by the buyer. So therefore, you're subject to the whims of the buyer. And cotton now and then has a good year. But other than that, we rely on government funding, and government must break loose from that funding. And that's why the tradable title for everyone who's a citizen of Zimbabwe should be entitled to own land and farm it, providing you measure the production. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Rusty. Actually, the Zimbabwe Information Minister, Musere, is quoted in News 24 article saying that all land held by beneficiaries of land reform programs under the 99-year lease, offer letters and permits will now be held under a bankable, registrable and transferable, more secure document of tenure to be issued by the government. But thank you so much, gentlemen, for making time for us.